David Trafford, welcome to the Cellar Studio at Belfield. It is awesome to have you here. I think you are definitely one of the reasons I got into this crazy world of wine. When I was running around your property as a sort of 12 or 13-year-old with your nephew Richie, and you had, I think, moved on from an extremely promising career in architecture and done your last architectural drawing, which was probably going to be the cellar at that point, and then also the original label design. And I'll never forget, maybe you were having a crisis of confidence, but Richie and I, as like 13-year-olds, were running through the cellar, running there and thereabouts, and you actually like pulled us aside and asked for our opinion on one of the wines that you pulled out from the barrel. And I just remember like thinking, wow, like to get my opinion on wine, or let alone opinion on anything from an adult was quite a big moment in my life. So I don't know if my guidance as a 13-year-old helped you in your path.
I'm sure it did.
But David, if you
all customers make a difference.
Yeah, exactly. All customer feedback matters. But yeah, I really do see you as like someone I just absolutely look up to in the world of wine. You are a humble legend. I'd love to kind of dig into how you got into this crazy sort of journey. Getting into the world of wine has many different entry points. How did you get stuck into your journey?
Yeah, well, it is quite a long journey, and I guess a lot of people come to wine by quite different sort of routes, even producers as well. But yeah, my parents were always interested in wine, and I drank wine at the table, like tiny little sherry glasses, also from that sort of age, or even a bit younger, actually, in the sort of 6-7-year-old. Only for sort of special occasions, but it was, part of the sort of family thing to have wine. And we lived in Durban at the time. And I think in those days, that was, the 70s, early 70s. It was not that common for people to have a wine cellar and to be interested in wine. And my
especially in
parents,
Durban.
Yeah, especially in Durban, they had this little cellar under the staircase, and it was kind of only, there was Zonneblom and Nederburg and Chateau Libertas and Bertram's and a few others. It was just about the whole wine industry, or the sort of higher end of the wine industry in one. So my parents were interested in wine, and then my dad retired pretty young, pretty early on. He was in the office furniture business and quite successful little business, and just felt like a change. And he got really bored pretty quickly being retired. So then decided to go farming. And in Natal, sugarcane farming is not the most inspiring thing to do. You basically grows like a weed, and you cut it every 2 years, and that's about it. And you kind of obliged to drink gin and tonic and not proper wine and proper drinks.
Cane and cream soda.
Yeah, exactly. So he had the idea to move to the Cape and buy a wine farm and farm grapes and stuff like that. And then even in those days, that was the mid 70s, wine farms were rather more expensive than he envisaged or imagined, and then fell in love with this piece of land right at the end of the Blaauwklippen Valley. It's about 285 hectares. We had to build a road, or my dad had to build a road just to physically get there for about 2 kilometers. So it was pretty adventurous. And when he came to the farm, realized that the farm didn't have a quota, so we weren't allowed to grow grapes.
So explain that, the quota.
So there was the KWV, which controlled the industry at the time, because there was a massive surplus back in 1928, I think it was. They kind of imposed this quota system, which was linked to your title deeds of your property. So you could only produce so much, but it was very sort of politically motivated. And basically farmers who were in with the government of the time sort of got bigger quotas and so on. And, we ended up with a piece of land where you literally weren't allowed to plant grapes. So that was, a bit of a bummer. So my parents grew rootstock for the nursery industry. And because we were so isolated with fresh, clean water and far away from other vineyards, I grew super grade virus-free rootstock.
That's incredible. I didn't know that part.
Yeah, we had actually at the time the biggest sort of rootstock orchard. I'm not really sure what you call it, but basically like an orchard or vineyard. And but the end result is just a bit like sugarcane farming. You're selling these sticks.
Yeah.
And my dad also got pretty bored of that and wasn't terribly interesting. And you only had one customer as well.
Yeah.
So it depended on the sort of demand. They would just reject half your crop if it was slightly crooked or something. So, it wasn't the most viable thing either. Not that there are a lot of viable farming options. It's quite sad because a lot of the virus problems that we have in South Africa actually come not just from the scion, the top, but the rootstock as well.
Yeah.
And so even though there was a lot of virus-free material, I'm pretty sure that a lot of non-virus-free material was going to nurseries. Anyway, that was for my dad not very interesting. So they sold off the most sort of arable part of the land, which was about 85 hectares. And then he developed the Montfleur conference venue, which I was busy. I'd studied by then and I was not quite qualified as an architect. So it was really my first building that I designed was the conference center. And I got the help of local architect Raymond Bomer in Stellenbosch to do the sort of legal drawings and the getting the drawings to council and so on. But I did the sort of sketch plans, as it were, and also helped with the actual build. My dad kind of owner built everything.
Wow.
And we kind of continue the same tradition. So shortly before my dad passed away in 91, then sold the conference venue to my sister and brother-in-law, and they moved down from Joburg, and it's actually their daughter Bridget that runs it. And it's quite a special place. There were quite a few of the meetings that took place while the ANC was still banned.
Isn't there the Montfleur Accord?
Yeah, there's the Montfleur scenarios.
That's right.
Developed by Clem Santa, and they were developed there along, what the different scenarios were for South Africa, and that helped clarify in the mind of basically the existing white government establishment that there wasn't really a future to continue. And similarly to, the liberation movement, that, it's not going to be the best outcome to just sort of willy-nilly, like just take over. They sort of mapped out these different scenarios, and it helped find common ground with the negotiating sort of.
And at that point,
unfortunately, they didn't have the plans for Eskom then.
And were any of those scenarios mapped out with a glass into Trafford at that point?
Not really. Well, maybe the odd experimental wine, perhaps.
So what was the moment that sort of transitioned you from architecture?
Yeah, so, having this sort of family interest in wine and also kind of being involved in the journey of moving to the Cape and farming and stuff. And being hugely disappointed at not being able to grow a vineyard and get into the industry. My dad and I basically planted a little vineyard and on the farm just for own use, So we basically made wine as a hobby. And we got so my first vintage was 1984. And
Wow.
I made wine every year, I've never missed a vintage.
Since 84?
Since 84.
Wow.
Although I've been overseas for long periods of time in the early days, but I was always back for sort of harvest, as it were.
Amazing.
And then when I worked as an architect, I took my leave was basically during harvest. So that was my holiday, doing harvest. So, it was a nice change from architecture. And slowly, with designing and drawing and so on, you do go through a few bottles of wine. So it they went hand in hand for a while. But then, it got too difficult, as the wine business grew. Our first vintage for, commercial production was 1992. So, I say commercial, it was literally just 5 tons. But, so a few years later, we grew each year. And once you start selling wine, then it obviously becomes much more time consuming. It's not just harvest and a few kind of, interventions. So then I basically stopped doing architecture about 6 years later or something.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
It's quite an interesting journey, because you as a family, having some experience with the rootstock and but I would imagine that was in that more arable area, sort of this sort of sandier, like lower slopes, but the kind of slopes that you currently farm and grow, were those more recently established? Because that's some gnarly terroir that you've got further up.
Well, actually, where the rootstock were planted were also quite high up.
Oh, really?
And that's actually, there've been 2 owners since, but now the race bought 15 or so years ago, and they have the Kiermont vineyards there, which we also buy fruit from them. So it's actually kind of gone full circle, and there's beautiful Cabernet Franc and a little bit of Merlot and some great Sijnn from those slopes. So it was pretty ideal vineyard land as well.
Yeah.
And then our vineyard that we planted in 1994, that is similar, a little bit higher up, but it's more north facing, and some of the sections are pretty stony and quite sort of poor soils, but there's also quite deep, rich soils, even though it's a kind of a 5-hectare block.
Yeah.
It varies quite a bit. So, there we've planted Syrah on the most kind of stony, poorest soil, and then on the richest soil we have Merlot, and then kind of in between the Cab Sauvignon and Cab Franc. Yeah.
And what were some of your inspirations or learnings? Because it seems like you've had some incredible experiences with wine from a travel perspective, having done a few harvests overseas and working with different winemakers. Was that one of your learning kind of curves in Bordeaux, or?
Yeah, I think for me the 2 sort of landmarks, I guess, to my wine journey, and that was 1974 Rustenburg Red, dry red, which just was the sort of first wine, that sort of took me to another place. It's like, for me, wine's great. Most wines are delicious and so on. But when you have wine that really sort of ethereal, that really sort of, that's like walking into a beautiful cathedral and you're uplifted. That's a sort of wine that was. And that kind of really got me intrigued at a sort of deeper level with wine. And then when I worked in London as an architect, I managed to get a month off to go and work the vintage in Saint-Emilion at Chateau Soutar. And that was a great experience because the owner he also studied architecture, although he kind of stopped halfway through, and he also worked a harvest or two in Australia. So I knew we had a bit of common ground, and he could speak English. So I approached him, crafted probably the best letter I've ever written, and managed to get the job. I even went for an interview. And it's actually interesting. I learned afterwards, because I've been back a few times. Unfortunately, it was sold a while ago, and it's become quite commercial now. But anyway, I learned it was 89. It was still a tricky time. And he was kicked out of his Rotary Club, and a lot of people sort of stopped befriending him and things like that because he employed a South African for harvest. So, hats off to him for, sticking to what he felt was right and whatever, or fair, not necessarily right. But anyway, so that was, I saw then, it was no adding of yeast, no filtering, just a lot of care in the vineyard and having, firstly, great terroir, great sites. There was no fancy stuff in the cellar. It was, fairly straightforward. And then, because winemaking back then was very technical, most winemakers had been to Geisenheim and learned the sort of more Germanic route, which is maybe more appropriate for certain styles of wine. So I kind of realized that it's actually an achievable thing to make wine and make decent wine that we can, sell. So it just gave me the confidence, really. And when I came back a couple of years later, in 92, then decided to buy a few tons and see how it kind of would go. And then it was a good time. We started selling in 94 when we were, allowed to export and so on. And there was a sudden interest in South African wine. So it wasn't the plan at all. We just had an open day and sort of sold a few bottles to friends and whatnot. And then a British importer called Simon Farr from Bibendum came along and really liked our wines, tasted through the barrels and everything, and was really excited and said, pretty much like, well, how much can we take? And literally took half our production for a few years until we sort of grew a bit. And he actually started Sijnn with us, the Malgas project. He's he's the other shareholder in the business. So again, it's kind of a little bit of a full circle story.
It's also it feels like your wine career has also been this constant sort of tugging on a golden thread and trying to explore and uncover, and you constantly inquisitive. Like whenever I chat to you, you joined another sort of study group, or and it's just it's such a it's such a testimony to the way that you approach your winemaking career, and also it's also good advice for like up and coming winemakers where you kind of started. You didn't start off to sort of make 100,000 bottles. You just started with what you could sell and built it up, gradually. And then I would imagine you also spent a lot of time in that one big market that you opened up in the UK.
Yeah, I didn't. I've never traveled more than once a year.
That's pretty good going for a South African winemaker.
But I have. I would. Initially, I went maybe every second year, and more recently less. But it is an important part of the job.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the part. I wouldn't say I don't enjoy it, but it's it's part of the job that you only want a certain amount.
Yeah.
It's not only tiring. It's you worry about what's happening back on the farm.
Yeah.
And as a smaller winery, you kind of have to be on top of all the different aspects of from growing the grapes to making the wine and sort of admin stuff. But I mean, obviously we employ people to do a lot of that work, but you've still got to be kind of on it. It's not like we have a viticultural manager and a sort of a marketing team and so on, so, and people want to see either the owner or the winemaker.
Yeah.
And in our case for the Trafford, I'm both. So, so yeah, it's
90% of
difficult
the time
to
I've
sort
been
of,
there, you're also the tasting host.
yeah. And, the thing is, it's also personality. Some people really enjoy speaking to lots of people and so on. I mean, I'm a little bit quieter and prefer kind of smaller groups and stuff, which means I've sort of got to do more work to reach more more customers effectively. So it's but I think it's one of the nice things about wine is that it's so multifaceted, from working in the vineyard to faffing around in the cellar and creating things, and then selling as well and interacting with customers. I mean, we have some amazing customers, just really nice people to meet and chat to, and it's from interesting walks of life and so on. So I mean, yeah, we are with you. So
under the bright lights. Yeah.
So it's really one can't complain. But like all businesses and all jobs, there are sort of parts of the work you'd rather not have, and especially the sort of admin type of things. And
what do you enjoy the most? Like, I mean, because I think, one of the things I love about kind of being more farm-based these days is you get a real sense of the seasons. You sort of removed a little bit more from that when you live in a city, and, now it's exciting because it's sort of bud break and there's this new growth in the vineyard. How what is some of your sort of highlights of the year in the sort of viticulture and winemaking kind of process?
Yeah, I think I really love the creative side of it, but it's a different creativity to designing a building or painting a painting or whatever. It's kind of letting nature take its course and being an observer and being a guide and being part of that sort of natural process. And obviously there's interventions as well, but I think that is that's amazing. It's really a nice part of the job, and I especially enjoy. I mean, it's kind of magical, really. The basic grape. I mean, as delicious as it is. It transforms into one of these things, and especially, during harvest time, it's still the fermentation, and it's still quite sort of rough, as it were. But then, literally a week or so later, when we ferment in tank and then straight to barrel, and after it's kind of settled a little bit, even within a week or two, it's not quite this in the glass, but it's quite surprisingly close. That sort of transition is fairly quick. I mean, it's a few weeks. Everything else in the wine industry takes years, if not decades. So that's quite nice and kind of immediate. But and I think from the sort of architectural background, design background, I think what I've really enjoyed a lot is literally kind of designing the wine from the vineyard up, having the sort of blank piece of ground, and then envisaging, what to do, and to kind of design the wine from the ground up. And, we get great advice from viticulturists and so on, but there's also a sense of what we want, and,
Do you think that's changed? Like, for you when you first started? Or was it more like, I just want to make a Cabernet, or as a, because I don't know, like it just seems like the industry's moved so much more towards that wine by sort of design matched to a vineyard.
Yeah, I think for me, it was always, from the time we planted our vineyard, there was always that kind of approach, and I think it's become more commonplace amongst top producers. As I say, I went to Bordeaux, and that was, I simply sort of adopted their approach, without copying. And I think because I had studied design, that was like an intuitive thing to do, not to, in architecture, you learn about other architects and other periods of architecture, but you don't go around copying sort of certain styles. You kind of adapt to your site and all those sort of things, and you draw on history of architecture.
Yeah, so it's almost like you were not copying, but you were learning from the sort of terroir matching process.
Yes,
the natural winemaking, reflecting where it comes from, rather than putting a big rubber stamp on this is.
And it's just kind of easier, and you can also say it's kind of lazier in a way. I think if your sole purpose is to be a winemaker and you study all the nitty-gritty and all the science and everything, it's impossible not to intervene and not to tweak and so on. I think that's your role. So, I think it's become a bit more commonplace to take more of a backseat.
Yeah.
But that was my approach from the beginning, partly because I didn't really know much better anyway. So, I think it's a sort of interesting process, and the way things have unfolded. And early days there were very few. There was Velgemint, was also like a sort of a hero producer. They were the first sort of small, serious producer, and not much else. Now there are a heap of brands producing just a few barrels. It's become quite common, which is great. I think obviously the industry has grown enormously and become much richer for it. But in those days, we were fairly unique, so we got a fair amount of attention, I suppose. We also sort of stick to pretty much a similar style of wine. I don't think it's changed hugely. A little bit. I think one's dependent on one's own palate and what one likes. And that's not a static thing either. But, there's a difference between that, your own sort of personal aesthetic changing over time and that influencing your winemaking, to like, going to some consultant, they say, oh, well, your wine's very good, but you need to do this or that to make it more sort of, market ready or whatever. And then you change everything you do to suit this sort of market. And then, oh my goodness, by the time you sell the wine, that pendulum has switched somewhere else. So sometimes, our style of wine is in fashion and sometimes not so much. You just have to sort of go with that. And I always say, we don't want to, we don't need to have lots of people like our wine. We rather have a few people like our wine a lot, because we've only got a little bit to sell and it's expensive. So people have to like it a lot. So that's kind of our take on that.
Brilliant. Right, David. So I think we have been sneaking a few sips, but it's time to talk a little bit about wine. It's, I think if you look at my personal wine collection, for what it's worth, it contains a lot of Trafford, and I think one of the things that always struck me was your origin terroir-driven approach, and also quite a minimalist process in the cellar, which I've always loved. I mean, that basket press I think has been there since before the cellar potentially. So yeah, it was quite a fortuitous moment to start a conversation with you about our Cabernet Sauvignon block in Elgin. And very sadly, similar to you, also losing my dad at a too young an age for him especially. And my dad's legacy was always around farming, and incredible farmer in Lawrenceford, which is a neighbour of the Trafford. So there's some connection there, and then kind of going a bit against the grain, similar to, wanting to plant a vineyard in the corner of the Blauklippen road. We, as a family, my father got some viticulturists in here and some advice, and decided in Elgin in early 2000 to plant Cabernet Sauvignon and a few other red varietals. So a little bit against the grain. And it's really interesting to have, like, in our glass, I think this is the first vintage of the Trafford Elgin Cabernet Sauvignon, or the Trafford Belfield Cabernet Sauvignon. And then we have, which is the 2019, right? 2020, sorry. And then this is the 2018, the Trafford Cabernet Sauvignon. So it'd be super interesting just to taste through these together and just have a conversation about Cabernet Sauvignon, climate, soil, all these things that impact. And I also noted a few really interesting sort of tactics that you use in the cellar in terms of creating complexity with, a single vineyard or smaller parcels of wine. Yeah, so what should we taste first?
Let's start with the Belfield.
Okay, all right. The Trafford.
Yeah, so
yeah, so I mean, I think just for clarity, we as a small winery couldn't really sustain like making wine and continuing that process at Belfield. So we mainly a grape farmer now and working with incredible winemakers. And yeah, it's incredible to be working with you and effectively you taking these grapes into your care and creating a wine out of them under the De Trafford label. And there will be some connections to Belfield, but that'll be revealed at a later stage. So yeah, what kind of got you like interested in a cooler climate cab?
Yeah, well,
was it my berating?
No, I mean, I think it's, when I saw the vineyard, it's just great. And I think, we're all aware of climate change. Elgin, is apple growing region. It's a little bit cooler than Stellenbosch, and most people have planted Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, a bit of Riesling and that sort of thing. But actually, it's globally, it's not really cool climate by global standards. So I think it just makes sense to plant Cabernet, and I think. Tasting your wines, it kind of made sense. The Belfield wines.
We did dig through a few old vintages.
Yeah, and they're great wines, and they show that it comes from a different place. I would say it's also different to Constantia, but yeah, I think it's exciting. I think it is a little more challenging with a single vineyard Cabernet. I think Cabernet is not really suited. It's generally blended, and blending isn't just about varietal blending. It's blending different blocks and different barrels and things like that. So we do pick a little bit of Merlot from you as well, as you know, and we don't. It's we just include it. I mean, we vinify it separately, and then pretty soon we just add it as soon as the malolactic's finished, which sometimes takes a while.
Yeah, especially with that Merlot.
So it just adds a bit of complexity. Also, we do, as you know, in 2 picks. We don't. It's not impossible, but it's easier for us to manage 2 tons at a time. So we do, 2-ton batches, and that also helps quite a bit. 2020 was quite a hot vintage, so actually it's kind of funny. Our first vintage is a little bit closer to a Stellenbosch wine than I kind of expected, but maybe it's a good start for for a new wine that it's not too different. But 2021 is certainly much more sort of cooler climate kind of character.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm really glad we didn't start the project in 2019, because that was my first year supposedly in charge of the vineyards, with some great help from Paul Wallace and then Kevin Watts now. But 2019 was a horror show.
Tricky vintage, I'm sure. I enjoyed the vintage in Stellenbosch, but it was quite challenging, and we just sort of managed to get most of our cab in before the heavy rains. I almost miss the challenge of those wetter years, because in the last couple of decades it's kind of been a bit boring, really. It's just more good days. More good ripening days. You're not sort of watching the weather and should we pick now or should we wait, and that's kind of the fun part of the fun of it. It's a bit more, but so maybe I also wanted to get that back, with a Cabernet and a little more marginal climate.
Don't worry, it's
later.
It's coming.
So this year was a little more tricky.
Yeah.
We picked the 2 separate lots nearly 2 weeks apart.
Yeah.
And actually the analysis is almost exactly the same. It's kind of strange. Grapes just hung there,
Yeah, it was always a thing. My dad always used to not be scared to let the cab hang up here. It's quite it's a thick skinned grape. It's very resilient. It's a lot easier customer than our friends who've got Pinot Noir maybe in the valley.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting to see how you've treated the wine in the cellar. I mean, you've used combination of different oaks. You've used some whole bunch. You've used some clay pots that I saw happening. I don't know if those went in the end.
A little bit, but not too much. They're very small.
It's really fascinating, and it's also because for us as a family, we kind of came from like a farming background, and my dad was very much in deciduous fruit, and then growing, and you can see the vineyards have been sort of developed by someone who knows farming, and the winemaking was something that he had to learn, and we had to kind of learn. I called myself an Instagram winemaker. I used to come and take a selfie during Punchdown, but it's been such an incredible journey to sort of see how you've taken it, and also really interesting to look at the creating complexity with with a sort of smaller sort of single vineyard. We're not supposed to put that on a label without permission, but it is essentially.
Well, it is pretty much, Well, we add the Merlot, so it's strictly not single vineyard, but it pretty much is, and it really is a beautifully managed vineyard. I mean, and it's what now more than 20 years old. It's really mature. It's 95% virus free, which is great. You've now taken out
it's looking a
offending 5% or
Yeah.
whatever, and that's fantastic. I think they're not that. There are a lot of vineyards one can buy grapes from, and we buy most of our grapes from our neighbor at Kimont, and apart from our own grapes, of course. But I think just seeing the vineyard and tasting the wine and our association, and it's great, and we can't wait to get it on the market.
No, it's gonna fly. It's gonna be really interesting, and thank you for having the patience and the the bravery. So I'd love to compare the two, just because it's really interesting. We were talking a little bit earlier. It's like the vineyard sites are not too dissimilar in terms of height above sea level.
Altitude is quite similar.
Yeah. So let's and they're both north-facing slopes, effectively. So let's taste the Stellenbosch, the Trafford Stellenbosch Cabernet.
But it's definitely, you can pick up that it's a bit warmer. We have, it's a bit more of a slope on our vineyard, so it's kind of facing the sun a little more. And we pick a little bit earlier. That's the other thing that I didn't mention. I mean, I always thought it would be nice. We used to make Pinot Noir, and I always thought it would be nice to get some Pinot Noir from either Elgin or Hemel and Arde. But then it's sort of slap bang in the middle of our Cabernet and Syrah harvest in Stellenbosch. So this also makes logistic sense for us, that we've pretty much picked our Stellenbosch grapes, and then it's just another week or two.
Before you go on holiday,
we go on holiday, another load of grapes, which is fine, which is good.
It's a tricky year, David. Then you're gonna have to postpone your
month,
bush trip. It's interesting to taste the difference, because I mean, for me, in our training, we always ask, what does it do for flavor? So what is, the soil, the climate, the winemaking techniques. But as you say, these two wines are definitely showing their Cabernet roots. I think the sort of Belfield or Elgin fruit is often more kind of like that red fruit profile. And I don't know why the tannin structure's got that softer, it's not as robust a wine. Is that just because of less sun, or
more cloud?
More cloud.
Yeah, it's a little gentler. Yeah, the berries they're still quite tiny, but the tannins are definitely softer. It's also got a bit of a plumminess to it. I mean, although there's only 10% or 14% Merlot, it's got. I mean, if I was given the wine blind, I probably would have thought there's a higher percentage of Merlot.
Yeah.
It's more of a Bordeaux blend, really, in terms of its flavor profile and style. It's a little lighter in color, and the whole texture and feel of the wine is a little lighter, but it's got depth of flavor and complexity, which for me is a key thing with a good wine, with a serious wine.
And the soil structures. So we've got that sort of red coffee clip, which I've seen, there's quite a lot of coffee clip on the way up the Blauklippen, but I think in that block.
Yeah, we don't have so much of. Yeah, not really that. We do have quite gravelly bits, but it's more of it's more loamy with us, with some stones, a little bit of gravel, but not too much. Yeah, here it seems much more gravelly, coffee clip kind of. But you also got quite a lot of clay.
Yeah.
But I think it's a sort of a harder clay. It's more. There's more differentiation between the gravel and the clay, whilst we have a bit more kind of loamy and more red. More, I think, a higher iron content. So we have a little bit. There's a sort of fatter, richer component to our cab, I would say, even though the tannins are a bit more intense and more robust. There's a bit more sort of density of fruit and sort of fleshiness, which I think is also part of those iron-rich soils.
Yes.
I mean, these soils also have iron, but I think that's also a difference. So it's a bit sort of bigger, richer, more structured wine. And the Belfield is, a little lighter, more ethereal. I think it's actually more, this is the style that we get naturally from the Helderberg. And that's, there's a place for that in the market. But I think a lot of people are looking for the more kind of lighter. I mean, I see lighter in a positive sense.
Yes.
It's not like
there's still depth there.
Yeah, it's got depth and complexity, but it's a little bit lower in alcohol, a little bit just kind of lighter and more approachable. But it's I'm sure it'll last a couple of decades as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. The older vintages, I think, also benefit from maybe the acidity, like not just tannin, as an aging
Yes.
component. So cooler climate usually gives you that that sort of that fresher
Yes.
profile. So yeah, it's super interesting, and we have to be well aged because that's a hallmark of your wines. I mean, I think you're one of the few winemakers that invites the trade to like just a casual 10 or 15 year vintage comparison of your Sijnn and
Yeah,
your different reds. So we have to make sure that they're long lived.
Yeah, we showed our 2002 this morning at another tasting.
Oh, really?
The perspective of Guild one, that's Merlot, Cab Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Yeah,
I've had quite a few of your
It was
99
showing pretty
Merlots.
well, yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, that 99 Merlot is a great example because when that wine was young, it was very drinkable. It was quite soft. It was just one of those vintages, and it didn't seem destined to age for long. And I recommended people drinking it early and so on. But 23 years later, it's still going strong. So
I'll never forget at the German Riesling festival that we somehow organized with Jörg Futzner back in the day at the Roundhouse, where one of the wines on display during a tasting was a 1973 Riesling or something from the Mosel, and the winemaker in a very Germanic way said it was undrinkable upon release, but now it's like an absolute gem because it's just aged beautifully. So I think acidity definitely can't be underestimated as a longevity tool.
For sure, the Belfield the structure is more acidity driven, and the Helderberg wine is more tannin kind of driven, the structure of the wine.
Well,
sort of
amazing.
backbone, so.
I look forward to sharing a few bottles of both and many more vintages to come, David. So your viticultural sort of, you're like I think you constantly look at pieces of land with a different eye to the rest of us. So, you went on a lovely little, holiday to Malgas and the Rita, and where most people see, a place to go fishing, a place to maybe just relax. You strolled up a hill, probably some of the rockiest terrain I've ever seen, and saw a dilapidated, or maybe not dilapidated, I don't know what it looked like, but ostrich farms are usually quite rocky.
Yeah.
And you decided that would be a good place to grow grapes. Can we dive into that? So I think with a little bit of Sijnn in the glass and just hear that story.
Let's make a blend quickly.
Yeah, good idea. That's probably in the best vintages we just do an equal blend. Super. Do the honors.
Yeah.
Because this is truly, truly pioneering. I mean, if cutting a 2-kilometer road up your Blauklippen farm was definitely pioneering and doing everything that your family's done, but this is insane.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it really started off from the fact that as a small producer, I didn't want to change the way we made wine, although you can make wine at a far bigger scale and keep the intrinsics. But I just thought we were offering something kind of special to the wine industry, keeping it the way it is, more or less. And we also, being at the end of the valley, it's difficult to get trucks there and all that sort of getting bottles. So logistically, it's also a bit of a pain. If we had to really grow, it probably makes sense to have a warehouse in Stellenbosch or something like that. Anyway, so, and traveling around the Western Cape and so on, you see spots that you think, wow, it would be fantastic to have a vineyard there. And this was one such spot. We went. We'd never been to this area before, and Rita and I was actually our first sort of weekend away from our kids, who the youngest one was just over over one, and kind of was for the first time on the bottle. And my mum looked after the kids, and we went away for a long weekend. Stayed at a place called Tides, and it poured with rain, as it doesn't usually do there. And we were quite bored and wandering around looking at properties just for fun. And then I noticed these soils that were just kind of so interesting. And Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the Rhone Valley in France has always intrigued me. And it's actually been a sort of family wine on special occasions. We'd sort of once or twice a year in the family have a bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. I'm not really sure why, but anyway.
I need to make sure I'm at more Christmases.
No, but this is way back when I was still like a kid. And so somehow like this crazy stony vineyard and, basically wines that didn't taste anything like South African wines.
No.
At that point, was something we would have occasionally on special occasions. And so, yeah, I love that image of these, old bush vines growing out of this stony soil. I mean, it just sort of reflects.
And like river boulder stones.
Yeah,
it just
reflects, the pudding stones, these round kind of things. And it's literally 85 to 90% stone and 10 to 15% soil. So, and it just, the whole thing of heroic viticulture and growing vineyards in crazy places, in volcanic islands and all this sort of thing. I mean, I just find it fascinating, and it's kind of just amazing how vines can grow in places like this and produce amazing wine because of it. It's not quite the more the vine struggles, the better the wine. I think that's a simplistic notion.
Yes.
But, you're going to get interesting wines from interesting terroir. I mean, in a sort of simple sense. So I thought, well, why not give it a go? And then we thought, well, we can't afford this. So maybe we phone a few friends. And the first 3 friends we phoned said we're in. So it came from being a sort of a whimsical idea to like, oh, geez, okay.
Game on.
And then we put in a ridiculously low price for the farm. And think, oh, well, this probably won't be accepted. And then that was accepted. And like, oh, geez. Now we're on the road. And planted the first vineyard in 2004. And the trouble is, you can't do it in too small a scale.
Yeah.
I mean, the birds just eat everything, and there's a certain amount of infrastructure you have to kind of have. And I also had in mind this kind of, that there is a recreational element to the area with the river and so on. So the idea of having a winery and bringing that kind of aspect and sophistication to the area. There's Du Hoop Nature Reserve nearby and so on. So there's really a lot going on for the area. It's just, a bit of a sort of a mull place. It's just kind of in the middle of nowhere. It seems a bit random, but there's exciting soils. There's about 350 houses along the river, holiday homes, and otherwise it's kind of wheat fields and ostrich farms and things. So I think it's been an exciting journey. We have a team down there now. We built the winery in 2014. Have quite a lot of visitors actually. So it's kind of taking root.
And congratulations are in order to your winemaker, Charlotte.
Charlotte, yes.
So she just won Young Winemaker of the Year from Tim Atkin.
That's right, yes.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And there's a slightly older winemaker as a mentor behind.
Yeah, that's sort of faffing around in the background. It's amazing. It's awesome. So she's been there from day one since we built the winery.
Yes.
I think thankfully she wasn't part of the move, because she probably wouldn't have stayed on more than a couple of months. But I never realized, I don't think many people move a winery from one place to another. and didn't realize what a hell of a job that was. But
Yeah.
anyway, we had, we literally moved all the barrels and full of wine and everything out there in 2014. So our first vintage was 2015. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and if from a winemaking perspective, you've, as we've established, you're not trying to like stamp your sort of nurture on it's nature that comes first in your approach. So what have these vineyards taught you versus what have you versus how have you molded them?
Well, I think they've taught me to be humble.
Yes.
But
as marginal vineyards do.
yeah. So no, I think one of the things is the wind there. It's not like super strong, but there's basically about double the wind compared to Cape Town or Stellenbosch.
Okay.
Well, let's say more the sort of Strand. I mean, the wind also varies a lot in different parts of the peninsula. But yeah, it's not aggressive winds, but there's most days it's just windy. It's close to the sea, so it's that kind of maritime sort of climate. It is pretty dry. It's only 350 millimeters of rain, and that's about the threshold for growing grapes. But we do have a bit of irrigation water from the Breda River to supplement. So yeah, I think the first challenge is just to get them to grow initially. When you have a little stick like this with a few roots,
just sticking them between two rocks,
putting them in the rocks. So that is quite tricky. So digging a big enough hole, and then we have to sort of bucket in a bit of soil or sand just to put around the roots, and then more or less put the rocks back. And then you have to water quite carefully in the beginning so that you don't wash the sand away. Otherwise, there's sort of air spaces left around the roots, and they dry out quite quickly. So yeah, it's one of those strange things. You can't overwater, and obviously you don't want to underwater. So getting them growing is a challenge. And then in terms of managing, because it's low rainfall and poor soils, we're never going to get a lot of, the growth is always going to be low. And people always sort of ask this about bush vines. I mean, everything we've planted is bush vines. And you only need a trellis if your vines are going to have shoot lengths more than, sort of 600 or 700 millimeters, which we don't really have. Only in a few little pockets or in certain years do we have sort of long shoots. So it's just common sense, rather than aiming for anything in particular, to grow everything as bush vines. But those shoots are unprotected, and when they start shooting, they're still vulnerable to the wind, especially in the first few weeks of their growth. So what we've done or learnt in a couple of years was to do an early tip and to get side shoots. And usually that's a problem if you have too thick, growth, too dense a canopy. But that's seldom an issue on our soils and our situation. So that's something we've kind of adapted to that site. More recently we using Etienne to Blanche to help us in the viticulture. He also helps me at the Trafford now. And yeah, he's a great help.
That's amazing, David. Yeah. I think you used a phrase earlier, that these marginal vineyards make you humble. And I honestly think that you are one of the most humble, great winemakers I've ever met. I think that approach to kind of your craft is, you're a master craftsman, but you're also extremely humble the way you go about things, and you massively respected, not just in the industry, but massively by our team. We've had some incredible experiences at the Trafford for Christmas parties. One of the first off-sites we did as a team, was actually at Sijnn. And yeah, it's just really a privilege to know you and work with you. And I feel like every time we have a conversation, I learn something, and you, like I said, you deliver it in this humble way with extreme gravitas. So toast to you.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, Allister. Yeah, it's really great to have customers like you as well. I always said, I'm not a marketing person, but for me it's like selling puppies. You want your wine to go to good homes, and we can't think of a better home where our wines go.
Well, I've got quite a few of your puppies. Thanks so much, David. And yeah, looking forward to many more vintages and many more exotic locations around Africa where your wine is being enjoyed. Cheers.
Let us know. Yeah,
absolutely. Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Allister. Cheers.